channels.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's panel discussion. I'm Kashana Hill, Executive Director at the Louisiana Fair Housing Action Center. And before we get started, I would like to turn things over to our interpretation team, who will share a little bit of information about interpretation for tonight's program.
Hola a todos, mi nombre es María Luisa, mis pronombres son ella. Hoy estoy con mi compa y cointérprete Judith, sus pronombres son ella y ella. Somos miembros del colectivo de justicia del lenguaje, Pancha Lenguas, basado en Pulpancha, Luisiana, también conocido como Nueva Orleans. Hi everyone, my name is María Luisa. My pronouns are she and her. I'm joined today by my comrade and co-interpreter, Judith, whose pronouns are she, her, they, them. We are members of Pancha Lenguas Language Justice Collective based in Pulpancha, Louisiana, also known as New Orleans. Pulpancha es la palabra choctaw, que significa la tierra donde se hablan muchos lenguajes. Pulpancha is the Choctaw word, which means the land where many languages are spoken. Como trabajadores de justicia del lenguaje, nos esforzamos a crear un espacio para que todos aquí presentes puedan entender y ser entendidos en el idioma en que nos sentimos más poderosos. As language justice workers, we strive to create space for everyone here to understand and to be understood in the language in which we feel most powerful. En Pancha Lenguas también trabajamos hacia la inclusividad de género en nuestro trabajo por la justicia del lenguaje. At Pancha Lenguas, we also work towards gender inclusivity in our language justice work. Notarán que estamos usando la letra E al final de palabras binarias en español. Esto no es un error, es nuestro intento en crear lenguaje más inclusivo e incluir personas de todos los géneros. You will notice us using the letter E at the end of gendered words in Spanish. This is not an error, it's us attempting to create more inclusive language and include people of all genders. Hoy proveeremos interpretación simultánea entre inglés y español como parte de nuestro esfuerzo para crear espacios multilingües. Today, we'll be providing simultaneous English and Spanish interpretation as part of our effort to create multilingual spaces. To access the platform, para acceder a la plataforma de interpretación, if you're using a computer, you will see a globe icon at the bottom of your screen with the word interpretation. Click on it and select the channel with the language of your choice, English or Spanish. Si está usando una computadora, vas a ver un icono de globo al pie de su pantalla con la palabra interpretación. Haz clic sobre él y selecciona el canal de tu lenguaje preferido, inglés o español. For smartphone or tablet, look for 3 dots that read More. Click on that to make your selection. Para teléfono inteligente o tableta, busca 3 puntos que leen más. Haz clic para hacer tu selección. And to create this space together, please speak at a slow and steady pace. If you're talking too fast, you'll see us do this hand signal to slow down. Please speak loudly and clearly, and we will do this hand signal if you're speaking too softly. Please try to say the full name of organizations or other acronyms. Keep an eye on the chat in case we send a message asking to slow down or to speak up. Keep your mic on mute when you're not speaking. And if you have headphones, please use them. 1 speaker at a time, please. Interpreters can only interpret 1 voice at a time. We don't want to be in the position of having to decide which voice to privilege over another. Y para crear este espacio juntos, por favor, hablen a un paso lento y constante. Si están hablando muy rápido, nos verán hacer esta señal de manos para ir más despacio. Hablen en voz alta y clara. Haremos esta señal con la mano si no podemos escucharte. Intenten decir el nombre completo de los acrónimos, por ejemplo, de diferentes organizaciones. Y échale un ojo al chat por si enviamos un mensaje para ir más lentamente o hablar en voz más alta. Mantén sus micrófonos en silencio si no están hablando y si tienen audífonos con micrófono, utilízalos, por favor. Y una persona a la vez. Los intérpretes solamente podemos interpretar una voz a la vez. No queremos estar en la posición de tener que decidir cuál voz privilegiar sobre otra. And lastly, please don't suffer in silence. If you have any problems with hearing us or the speakers, please send us a message in the chat. Y por último, por favor, no sufran en silencio. Si tienen cualquier problema escuchándonos a nosotros o a los presentadores, por favor envíenos un mensaje al chat. And lastly, thank you for your commitment to creating a multilingual space. Y por último, gracias por su compromiso en crear un espacio multilingüe.
Thank you. As always, we're so honored to have our interpreters with us tonight and are looking forward to an inclusive and accessible conversation. So I want to take a moment to, again, introduce myself. My name is Kashana Hill. I am Executive Director at the Louisiana Fair Housing Action Center, and I'm so excited for tonight's conversation. This will be Louisiana Fair Housing's last Fair Housing Month event. Fair Housing Month is celebrated across the country in April. This is the month in which the Fair Housing Act was signed into law back in 1968. And so during this time, fair housing advocates and community members across the country honor the roots of the Fair Housing Act, and we look back on victories and think ahead to all the work that remains to be done. And so tonight, we're really excited to bring you this panel as a way to close out our Fair Housing Month events. I do want to just briefly share a little bit about the Louisiana Fair Housing Action Center. The work that we do is dedicated to eradicating housing discrimination and segregation. We do that by working to challenge discriminatory policies and practices through litigation and policy advocacy, as well as through the provision of foreclosure prevention counseling and educational offerings designed to inform community members about their fair housing rights. During the COVID-19 pandemic, we have focused much of our efforts on challenging policies that work to evict families, as well as championing policies that will stop evictions across the state in light of the COVID-19 pandemic. To that end, we are also providing free legal representation to people who are facing eviction. And we understand at the Fair Housing Action Center that evictions are a racial justice and fair housing issue. And so that lens, that perspective, and that understanding really informs a lot of the eviction defense efforts that we are engaging in. So with that framing, I want to introduce everyone to our panelists that we're so lucky to have with us tonight. First, Maurice B.P. Weeks is the co-executive director of the Action Center on Race and the Economy, which is abbreviated ACRE. Jose Lopez is also joining us tonight. Jose serves as the San Diego lead organizer at ACE Institute. ACE stands for the Alliance of Californians for Community Empowerment. And we also have Mike Leyva, who's the Director of Development at City Life Vida Urbana. And Mike is joining us from Boston. So each of these panelists are very experienced organizers, and we are so lucky to have their expertise and their experience and their perspective here tonight. And so we're hoping that everyone who is joining us, whether that's via Facebook or through the Zoom link, we hope that everyone will share any questions that they may have. I certainly have some questions, and we'll have some questions for the panelists throughout the evening, but we would also love to hear all of your questions. And so if you do have them, please go ahead and enter your questions using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen or in the chat, and we will do our best to answer those questions throughout our time together. So turning now to our first question for our panelists. We would love it if you could introduce yourselves and the work of your organizations to us. And in that introduction, we'd also appreciate if you could tell us briefly about your communities and current campaigns that you have going on. We'd also specifically like to know how the current eviction crisis is impacting your communities and how have you responded? Maurice, would you like to start us off?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So again, my name's Maurice. I am the co-founder and co-executive director of the Action Center on Race and the Economy. I'm based in Detroit, Michigan, though I am a product of public housing in Newark, New Jersey. ACRE does work around the country with lots of different community organizations, helping them with both research and campaign strategy around housing. And I want to start by talking a little bit about what my community here in Detroit has been going through during the pandemic started. Detroit was already at a point with our housing where many people are being foreclosed and evicted on for things like missing tax payments or missing utilities payments. And the pandemic has really, really for a moment sped those things up tremendously. So for-profit landlords in particular took this as an opportunity to really try and clear out some of the property that had tenants that had been able to maintain their homes for the past few years. And luckily, local organizers here were able to win a moratorium on evictions that were happening because of utilities or tax foreclosures for the duration of the pandemic. But having personally done work around the country, I know that this isn't a special story. These are things that have been happening really all around the nation since the pandemic started. As as much as we I think that we should focus on great stories of neighbors helping each other and other people stepping up during this pandemic. There are groups of folks who have really taken this as an opportunity to really go after the most vulnerable folks and Black and brown folks and disabled folks, et cetera, in our communities. One of the ways that ACRE has fought back is by doing a little bit of research to try and identify who exactly some of these main bad actors are. Often that's difficult because they try very hard to hide their beneficial owner. They use lots of sneaky corporate structures, but we're doing the research to be able to pin them down so that folks like Mike and Jose, who are on the ground in different cities, can use that information and then go after some of these bad actors. So I think in both my community and throughout the rest of the country, it's been really, really rough. But I've also seen some amazing organizers and amazing tenants really stand up and fight for the world that I think that we need, and hopefully this helps to bring it about.
Thanks, Maurice. So we'll definitely be having some follow-up questions and be wanting to get into some of those details for sure. Jose, would you like to introduce yourself next?
Yes, thank you. My name is Jose. I'm the lead organizer at ACE in San Diego. ACE is the Alliance of Californians for Community Empowerment. We're a grassroots community organization. I actually joined ACE about 6 years ago as a member. Somebody was knocking on doors in my neighborhood. My neighbors were organizing to get stop signs and speed bumps on our street. And I joined because I wanted to see a trash can and a light at the park. Since then, I became really active with ACE and eventually got a job organizing. And since then, now I'm the lead organizer. This pandemic, definitely, like Maurice said, made a lot of the problems that we already had worse. In the beginning, in San Diego, in San Diego, our office is actually like 10 minutes away from the border. And in San Diego, historically, we've been very conservative. Our county has been ran by old, rich, white men. All of them have been Republicans until recently. And now for the first time, we have like a Democratic majority. So that has helped. But when the pandemic first started, we knew, that we were going to be like that people like we started to reach out to our members and community members, and everybody's biggest concern was how are they going to pay the rent next month. Many of them were going to be able to pay April, just barely, but May was a real big concern. So we started to reach out to local elected officials and our members and supporters, and moved quickly to pass local moratoriums. Those moratoriums um, helped, but definitely, we're not enough. And we started a campaign to cancel the rent and also stop evictions. Right now, we're in the process of passing an eviction ban for the county of San Diego that would stop all evictions except for those related to health and public safety. So we're really excited about that. And that has to do a lot with like the work that has been done in the past years to change the county, because for the first time we have people are who care about keeping people housed. So that's exciting. And I'll stop there because I think there's a lot more to add. But yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Jose. It's really exciting to hear about some of the things that y'all are doing. And, you know, as those of us who live and work in the South know, there's like a world of difference, right, between what is happening here and what is actually possible. So I always appreciate hearing from people working in places where these kinds of goals are actually attainable, right? And so we're definitely going to be asking you down the line a little bit more about how those of us in places that we don't really have that infrastructure built up yet, how can we get there, right? Because right now, what you're talking about in terms of that campaign and a moratorium really feels like a dream, but it's definitely something that we hope we can attain at some point. So thank you. Mike.
All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Mike Leba. I live in Boston, although I was born in LA, actually near Jose, I think. But yeah, so I work at an organization in Boston called City Life Vida Urbana. We're a 50-year-old grassroots community organization committed to fighting for racial, social, and economic justice and gender equality by building working class power. We promote individual empowerment, we develop community leaders, and build collective power to affect systemic change and transform society. In Boston, like a lot of places around the country, we're a pretty segregated city. We're still grappling with the legacy of Jim Crow, of redlining, of disinvestment, planned shrinkage, some urban planning gone crazy, displacement, and now gentrification to the point where luxury development is threatening a lot of the folks who have been in the city for decades. My organization organizes renters and homeowners against displacement by corporate landlords, luxury developers, and banks. Like many, our work is concentrated in working class Black and brown neighborhoods of Boston. Many of the folks that we organize are immigrants from Central and South America and the Caribbean. And then just a little bit about kind of our work and how we do what we do. We have an organizing strategy, which we call the sword, the shield, and the offer. The idea is the sword is direct action, public protest, pressure against displacement and in defense of our communities. The shield is using the legal system, including fair housing, but the court process, working with pro bono legal partners to protect and defend our tenants and homeowners against displacement. And the offer is a permanently stabilizing outcome, both for the family and for the community. Oftentimes for like a foreclosed home, we hope to try to get that home back in the hands of the former owner. Or in some cases, we'll try to get an apartment building in the hands of a land trust that we work with locally. This kind of community organizing effort really seeks to, like I said, protect and the families that have lived in Boston for decades, many of whom, you know, have really deep and important social networks like in their community, and and so I think that's kind of what I'll share about our work for now. But I'm definitely looking forward to getting in the conversation in a bit.
Thanks, Mike. And I actually am going to ask you a follow-up question, if you don't mind. And then I would love Maurice and Jose, if y'all have any thoughts to share, please jump in on this. But, you know, the conversation that we're having tonight is focused on organizing, right? Tenant organizing. And I, you know, just in my experience, tend to see sometimes those of us who work in nonprofit spaces not really having clarity on what organizing is, and as it relates to community, what I would call a community engagement, right? Civic engagement, political engagement. And I think sometimes there can be a conflation of the two. I think, in my experience, those are different. I am certainly very clear that, you know, I am not an organizer. And while the Louisiana Fair Housing Action Center certainly works in partnership with community and engages community, we also aren't organizers. And so, Mike, given kind of your detailed, you know, discussion about what organizing within your organization looks like, could you just maybe elaborate a little bit on the difference as you see it, or the differences between organizing and community engagement work, and then how those two can complement each other and work together? And then, of course, again, Maurice and Jose, please share your thoughts if you have them as well.
Sure. Yeah. You know, one of the things that's just worth kind of mentioning is the question of who community or who benefits from development is a question that our folks don't get to weigh in on very much. You know, even though one of the things I noticed was you mentioned, you know, working in the South and the real conditions that that creates around what's possible. In Boston and in Massachusetts, you know, we have like a blue state house. We have a Republican governor, but, you know, he's kind of, you know, he's more moderate than others. But the stranglehold of real estate money on the elected representatives of our government is like just as real as it is in other states. I once worked, you know, before I kind of did community organizing, I worked in politics, like doing campaign work. And the first boss that I ever worked for, she literally told me real estate money is like the only kind of clean money you can get in this city. And I thought that was so interesting because, of course, you know, as somebody who lives in the neighborhood, like that's the one thing that's like, you know, maybe not the one thing, but it's one of many problematic kind of ways to look at it. I think engagement. So if the goal of so much of what we're fighting is this notion that real estate can and should be used as a speculative investment. So like if you're building a luxury development in Boston, for instance, if you acquire a piece of land, let's say it's a triple decker, we have a lot of housing that's like 3 units on a pretty small lot, pretty large buildings. If you acquire, you know, a lot and you want to bulldoze it and build a new luxury development or do a kind of gut remodel, you can make a lot of money doing that here. And but the question then becomes, is the land that we're on, are our communities only for the purpose of you know, of doing that luxury remodel and maximizing dollars that you can profit? Or is the role of housing, as we understand it, to actually provide a service or a social good for the community? And so that question of what is the value of this land is really important and central to our work. Is it for the purpose of cashing in, or is it for the purpose of providing a social good? And not all the time, you know, it's like you can live in the middle of that. I'm not suggesting, you know, that's what we should be aiming for, but on the community organizing front, I would say, you know, for us, we definitely look at it as um, we kind of view our work as the five masses. That's kind of our organizing frame. We do mass meetings. We do weekly meetings every single week for tenants or homeowners that are facing displacement. Tuesday in English, Wednesday in Spanish. We've done that for over a decade. But the whole point is to get people in a room understanding this is bigger than me. This is bigger than my situation. This is a systemic thing and I have allies in my corner. The second mass is casework. So for those folks who come in looking for support, we get to the heart of what is your issue, who are you fighting, and how can we unite your particular circumstance with others. So in a lot of cases, it looks like a group of tenants that are fighting the same landlord. Sometimes it's a bunch of people who are facing foreclosure from a certain bank. And so basically doing some type of collectivizing of all those circumstances helps us identify where is the target and where should we be focusing our energy and our campaign work. The third is mass actions. We're a really grassroots activist organization, and we do a lot of mass action. One, for visibility, but two, to, like I said, the sword is kind of our ability to assert what we want, what we demand. And so we oftentimes do that through mass actions. We do leadership development of all of the folks in our base. And we do kind of weekly political discussions. We have a Black feminist praxis circle. All of this stuff is kind of meant to build the leadership of our base and of our communities. And there's one other mass that I'm completely forgetting, but it'll come to me. I'll put it in the chat. But all of that to say, really our work is centered on taking somebody who has a need, who is facing displacement, and connecting them with others in the community that are facing the same issue, have faced the same issue, and basically collectively organizing them so that they can have a united front, they can have support from each other, they can have the legal support that they need, and they can assert their right to remain in the city.
Thanks, Mike. That's really great. I appreciate that. And I definitely think, it's helpful to sort of have that understanding of the ways in which you all are doing such holistic work. So I appreciate that. Thank you. Jose, Maurice, did you have anything that you wanted to add around sort of the differences between, mass outreach? I see that, Mike, you put that into the chat, so thank you. Jose, Maurice, did you have anything you wanted to add around the sort of differences between organizing and community engagement work, or about the way those two work together, or?
Yeah, just one. Well, I mean, there's a couple different differences, and I'll say that the two often can be complementary to each other. But I think one main difference that I like to think about is the difference between defense and offense. So, there's a lot of things that we need to defend folks against, especially vulnerable folks like tenants or even homeowners in poor areas, neglected areas. There's just lots of attacks from, some of the real estate industry, like Mike talked about, to often, the federal government historically has not always been on the side of tenants and of poor people and of Black and brown people. So, I think of that as really important work that you can get through advocacy and community engagement. And, I am blessed to work with lots of people who do that work, lawyers that sort of dedicate their time to fighting back when people get in unjust evictions, and, advocates who, spend all of their time in state houses fighting the thankless job of trying to get these bills passed. And then on the other side, there has to be a group of people who are mobilized to really imagine what the world could look like in the future. And the way that is done is through building power, like both Jose and Mike were talking about. So getting groups of people together and not talking about not just dealing with, you know, how do we deal with people's problems that are coming in, but how can we take some of those people who are all maybe dealing with similar problems and create a network of them all together to push so that this doesn't happen to anyone ever again. And those two things are separate. They're both really, really important. If you don't have defense, then people are not going to be willing to join your offensive fights. People really want to just stay in their homes. So if you don't have anyone just helping them do that, you're not going to have offensive fights. But also, if you don't have those offensive fights, we'll just keep on this hamster wheel of bad things are happening to people, and we've got to find more pro bono lawyers to help with people's evictions. And we all have seen how that turns out. I mean, lots of fair housing centers are overwhelmed with the amount of demand that's coming in for folks to help them. So I think of the organizing, the community organizing, as a way of building power to really shift the ground that we're playing on entirely.
That's great. Thanks, Maurice. Jose, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, so like in ACE, we're in an interesting place because we are both like a C3 and a C4. So there's like a part of our work that's like political, and there's another part that's non-political. And I like how Maurice brought up like the offense and defense. I always like to think about also like when we're not in an election season, we're like building up our army, right? We're doing like the civic engagement, like or the community engagement. But then when it's like election time, it's like game time. And it's like Marie said, we had a lot of people calling us that were like trying to figure out like how to get like the protections that were offered by the moratoriums, or how to apply for the rental assistance. And when folks called us about that, we told them how to do that, but then we asked them, like, do you think this is enough? Do you think the government is doing enough? What do you think they should do? And then we got them to take an action, whether it was like calling into the next meeting, sending an email, asking them if they wanted to organize. And we went from folks who were coming to us for a service to getting them to actually start to think about what are the issues that are impacting them and what are the solutions that they're trying to see. And like from the beginning of the pandemic to now, like we had to switch over to like Zoom meetings. And we did the Zoom meetings weekly. People who had never done Zoom, didn't even have an email address, learned how to use it. And we went from having like 30 people at our first meeting to having now like anywhere between 50 and 60 every week, of members who are like getting updates and planning like next steps to keep on pushing. So we're really excited to like engage the community, but like around these issues, and like give them the opportunity to like fight for the change that they want to see. And what's been exciting is that we've been able to win several things along the way, and like every win kind of gets them pumped up, and they're like, wow, like even though I just made one call or send an email, I feel like it was thanks to the work that I did that we got this done. So it's really exciting to see that.
Thanks. Yeah, and thanks to you all for that input. I just felt like it was really important, like as we get deeper into the conversation, that we're all kind of on the same page about what we're talking about when we're talking about organizing work and what you all are doing across the country. So getting into the eviction crisis a little bit more. I want to ask you all how you see the eviction crisis as a fair housing and racial justice issue. Can you share a little bit about who is being most impacted by the eviction crisis during the COVID-19 pandemic? And then how does all of this intersect with racial disparities in COVID risk? So I'm not sure who wants to take this first. But again, if you have any thoughts you want to share around how the current eviction crisis is a fair housing and racial justice issue, that would be great.
Yes, I'm happy to jump in first. I mean, I think as we've been saying, this crisis really was sitting on top of a housing crisis that already existed, right? And we know that housing crisis that existed it was one that was affecting Black and brown people overwhelmingly disproportionately. So, Mike mentioned gentrification. We've seen in several cities that, had sizable Black or brown populations, rents going up to such high rates that those folks can't afford it and being moved further and further out from the center of the city. And you might think, oh, well, at least they have a place to stay. They've found somewhere with lower rent. But the jobs didn't move to where they moved. They still need to commute, an hour, 2 hours to work round trip every single day. And we know based on other economic stats that, Black and brown folks are more likely to be making less money and have less savings and have worse credit scores than their white counterparts. So building on top of what has been economic racial disparities since the beginning of this country, it's not surprising at all that we're seeing as this crisis goes on, the folks who are most behind on rent are the ones who are Black and brown folks, the ones who are not being hired back into their jobs, the folks who are going to be most vulnerable when eviction moratoriums start to lift, and we'll have fewer opportunities of places to go. We know that lots of landlords are just waiting for the moment that the moratoriums lift to evict folks, and there isn't a plan for what people are going to be able to do when they now have an eviction on their record, 12 months of back rent, they still don't have a job, there's no assistance from the federal government. We don't know what's going to happen. And it's a really, really scary notion. And it is one that builds on the economic disparities that we just see in everyday America.
Yeah, thanks, Maurice. I just want to say that's a really important point about sort of the history, right? We just can't escape like these inequitable systems that our current housing system is like built upon, right? And we know there's research that shows that communities that were redlined, 60 years ago are communities that already had very high rates of eviction before the COVID-19 pandemic, and then those rates have only risen, right? So if we overlay the redlining maps with eviction rates and COVID infections and hospitalizations and deaths, they're all the same. So you're absolutely right about how that history is actually still tied into what we're seeing today. Jose, Mike, did you have anything you wanted to share about how this current eviction crisis is a fair housing and racial justice issue?
Sure. And yeah, I really appreciate you, underlining that for us, Kashana and Maurice, for mentioning the history that we're dealing with. This is a layering of crisis. In one way, COVID feels like an acceleration of a previously existing crisis for our people. Last month, we actually put together a report looking at evictions in Boston's communities of color during the first year of the pandemic. So we're kind of at this important milestone of we're a year into COVID. And so this report we worked with our partners at MIT to do this report. And what this report found was that Boston's communities of color, even before the crisis and especially during the crisis, are bearing the brunt of COVID-19 evictions. Over 70% of all eviction filings in this last year occurred in census tracts where the majority of renters are people of color, even though only 47% of all Boston rental housing is located in this neighborhood. So it disproportionately impacts renters or census tracts where the majority of renters are people of color. By contrast, only 30% of eviction filings happen in tracts with majority white renter populations. The kind of second part to that is so what that means. Well, what the implication for that is, what that means is that the rate of eviction filings was about twice as high in areas where the majority of renters are people of color. And looking specifically at areas with the majority Black renters, the eviction filing rate was almost 4 times as high as areas with majority white renters. So this has an incredibly disproportionate impact on communities of color, specifically Black communities. And even though there has been a moratorium, both statewide in Massachusetts as well as the CDC moratorium, during this last year, statewide judges have given landlords the green light to evict about 2,000 households since last October. We have a statewide moratorium that expired last October, and since then, 2,000 households have been pushed out. And what we're seeing is actually, so Massachusetts is one of these states where you can evict somebody no fault, and we're seeing much more use of that. Instead of, it's illegal to currently evict somebody for non-payment of rent under the CDC moratorium, but at least here in Massachusetts, you can still evict them no fault. And so what we're seeing more frequently are building clear outs and no fault evictions.
Jose?
Yeah, definitely. I think it is an ongoing fight for equity. We have seen definitely that it's like it's people in the Black and brown communities that have been impacted the most, right? The same people who are like low wage workers who don't have health care, and like it's like I know in San Diego a lot of people, because the rent is so high, tend to live with like 2 or 3 families. Like I have a friend, there's 13 people in their house and it's a 3-bedroom duplex. So like imagine when somebody gets COVID there, where they're supposed to quarantine. And we definitely have seen that like the places that have more evictions have more COVID cases and more COVID deaths as well.
Thanks for that, Jose. Yeah, that's a really important point. That one of the major concerns of advocates and organizers and renters has been that when people are evicted, they may be forced either into homelessness or into more crowded housing conditions, right? And if they don't have anywhere to go, they may have to go live with a family member, and then you've got more people together. And it sounds like in your community, people were already, because of the high cost of living, kind of, sort of living in overcrowded conditions that would make them more susceptible to, having COVID-19 if it happens to spread within that living situation. So thank you for mentioning that. I wanted to turn now to solutions, right? When we have conversations like this, we can just go on and on and on about the problems. There are so many. But, it is important to share what solutions are out there. So can you all tell us what solutions do you think we need at the local, state, and federal levels? What solutions are your organizations and your communities fighting for? Also, relatedly, has this crisis changed your perspective, tactics, or understanding of what is possible?
I could go first for that one. So it's really interesting because we feel like we don't have any protections, right? Like I know California is supposed to be very progressive, and out of all of California, San Diego is like a very Republican place. I just found out today that the movie American History X was actually based on the director's experiences growing up in San Diego, and like so we, compared to the rest of the state, don't have many protections for tenants. But it's crazy to think though that we have like the strongest protections in the country compared to like state when it comes to statewide. So we feel like we don't have nothing, but we have way more than everybody else, which is crazy. And for us, like our big thing is canceling the rent during the pandemic. canceling the rent and the rent debt that people have accumulated, and making sure that we can stop all evictions so that nobody is evicted. Alameda County passed an eviction moratorium that stopped all evictions except for those connected to health and public safety when the pandemic first started. And in the like during the whole pandemic, they had like less than 10 evictions. In San Diego County, we had like almost 1,000. Um, and really shows like the difference. So I think definitely canceling the rent for tenants who can't pay due to COVID and stopping all evictions during the pandemic would be like a great start for now. But then moving forward, things like rent control locally, stronger protections for tenants like just cause ordinances, anti-harassment ordinances, and like really looking at housing as a human right. We think that housing needs to be affordable, it needs to be stable, habitable, and accessible. Um, and I think those are like I guess like the policy solutions that we think. But I think at the end of the day, it really comes down to the tenants organizing and demanding these things. And really, like during the pandemic, it's changed the way that we did things. We had to do things virtually. We had to do things like car caravans and figure out other ways to get our message out. But it also really showed us how we needed to also not just work with our members and the tenants, but also the other organizations that were around, like the legal groups. We had to figure out what resources were out there. In the beginning, like for us at ACE, we kind of pride ourselves of being like not like a service organization, right? We don't give stuff to people. We get together with people to fight for those things. But then when COVID first started, we had to figure out where were the food banks, what were like the different things that people can get connected with, and like through that research, we found out that there really wasn't anything. We learned that at the Legal Aid Society in San Diego, they had like $100,000 that came in for a year to help all the tenants in San Diego County. And like through our partnership, since we've been working with Legal Aid and other groups, we've been able, and like right now we're having conversations with the county about getting them like millions of dollars every year for them to help more tenants. But it was because we were able to identify that need and then build these coalitions. We also we got together with local groups and created this, what we call the Cancel the Rent Coalition. We also got together with legal providers and nonprofits to start an eviction prevention collaborative. It's like right now barely kind of like kicking off, but definitely like learning about the laws that other places have. It's funny, we're actually like doing the same thing right now, but we're looking at laws in other counties in California with our members to figure out what is already out there that we can push for here locally. And like a big thing too has been like those political dynamics, right? Like where for the first time, like we have a Democratic majority at the county and we're passing some of the most progressive things we've ever seen in San Diego County. Like even today, there's like a deportation defense fund that is hopefully going to be approved soon. And a few years ago, we would have never been able to have that in San Diego. But it's because we've been building up our base and been able to like participate like electorally too, where we've been able to get several different elected officials elected locally and at the county. And like that has also helped us be able to get things done.
Thank you, Jose. That's great. I feel like there's so much hope in all of what you said. That's exciting, and I really appreciate sort of the the creative thinking and like figuring out ways to like get it done, right? And I love hearing about what your members are doing. And I just wanted to mention that in the chat, somebody who's here locally was sharing a little bit of background about in New Orleans, we've had evictions continuing to go on. And we've got an amazing group of organizers here, the New Orleans Renters' Rights Assembly, that actually has organized a few direct actions to actually stop eviction court because, you know, in spite of the CDC moratorium, evictions were just continuing. We had a statewide moratorium here that lapsed last June. And so there was a couple of months, right, between when our statewide moratorium ended and then the CDC eviction moratorium was announced. And so in that interim time, you know, folks here were doing like, you know, y'all are doing in California and trying to figure out ways to keep people protected and keep people safe. So definitely appreciate hearing that perspective and about all those potential solutions for sure. Mike, Maurice, what do y'all want to add?
Emphasize a little bit what you just said, Kashana, about like the direct action.
Yeah.
You know, that definitely was a big part of like us getting those wins. When the city's budget was going to come out, there was no money aside for rental assistance. Same thing with the county. But because we organized actions like a caravan around the mayor's house, where we, I guess, terrorized his children, his 17 and 19-year-old children were terrorized because we're honking outside of his house. But we figured like, if we can be safe and comfortable in our homes, you know, why should they, right? So it was crazy to hear that there's 17 and 19-year-old kids were terrorized. And we also had a county board of supervisor that had put like $10 million aside for a horse estuary, and didn't want any money for rental assistance. So we went to her office and did a protest about human housing over horse housing. And I think that really got to her. But the county went from $0 for rental assistance to 24 million because we were out there asking for 100 million. So they didn't give us 100, but we got 24, and another 1 million for legal counseling and tenant services. And because so many of our members speak Spanish, they called in Spanish and highlighted the fact that the county's interpretation services were horrible. And after they ended up adding $2 million to interpretation services for the county also. And it was because the tenants were there asking in their own language for the things that they wanted.
Thank you. Yeah, it's just really interesting to hear about how direct actions have resulted in change and shifts across the country for sure. So there's absolutely a lot to learn there. Mike?
I mean, yeah, that direct action gets the goods. That's the theme. But yeah, I think, you know, just to say, I think what COVID did was it really did allow us to think differently about what's possible. You know, kind of what Jose mentioned about Alameda County and that kind of eviction moratorium. That's huge. You know, I would have, if you asked me 2 years ago, in Massachusetts, we passed, you know, a similar eviction and foreclosure moratorium. At the time when it was passed, it was one of the strongest in the country. And if you would have, and it basically ground the entire legal eviction process to a halt, and during COVID. And if you would have asked me 2 years ago if that was possible, I would have laughed in your face. And it's, you know, and it's just one of those things where I don't think, given, you know, outside of the circumstances that we found ourselves in and the community, you know, the challenges our communities were struggling with, I don't think that would have been possible. But I also don't think we would have thought of it even, you know, like that one thing about our communities just generally is that they're so freaking resilient and so, you know, they know what they need, you know what I mean? And we know what we need. And so like, for instance, when we kind of started getting word about COVID, we had an action like that week in March, and the whole action was around shutting down housing court, not because we knew the economic fallout that would happen, but because we knew that it would be a vector for spread of infection. So if there's a virus and you're putting a whole bunch of people in small courtrooms in cramped conditions with no ventilation, what do you expect to happen? And how is this going to impact our community's health? And we were able to get a temporary shutdown. We made it more formal with a really strong eviction and foreclosure moratorium. Like I said, this kind of stopped almost all stages of the eviction process. Like you couldn't even go to land court unless it was an emergency, similar to what Jose said about Alameda, unless it's like a threat to health and safety. But what this caused was it gave rise to like these so-called self-help evictions, where a landlord would like just go in and change the locks. They would threaten, they would intimidate. In some cases, we had landlords threatening to call ICE on our members. But and so we, as a organization and as a movement, we had to figure out how to deal with that. Now, this was like the new reality that we were dealing with. And even though, once the community kind of got its footing, once we were in a place where we felt like there was enough space for us to proactively strategize, then we began thinking about accumulating debt and how we could forgive rental debt and how we could, basically have an equitable recovery out of this. There has been a lot of federal legislation that's passed that for us has kind of we have rental arrearage programs in Massachusetts. They're not for homeowners, but they are for renters, although there is a temporary homeowner one. But they were just kind of flooded with resources. And the infrastructure that we had for those programs was really struggling to keep up. So we had, done some analysis of how many people were facing displacement within Massachusetts, and the number was over 100,000 households. And so, what was a very common occurrence would somebody would apply to this kind of rent arrears program, their application would go into a black hole, and they wouldn't get any follow-up. They wouldn't hear for months, 2, 3 months, 4 months sometimes. And even when they did hear, there was no requirement that the landlord take it or comply with the documentation that's required. And so there's a whole lot of loopholes, that are kind of in the system that we're kind of sitting in. And like I said, we're seeing a whole lot of no-fault evictions. So our current legislative focus locally, statewide rather, is kind of around closing some of these loopholes, saying that you can't discriminate as a landlord. You can't discriminate on the source of income. So if somebody's paying rent from wages that they earned at work, that's great, but you can't refuse it if it's from the state rental arrears program, or if it's from another, it's not your business where the money's coming from. If you're getting your money, that's that should be enough. And let's be real, rent arrears programs are landlord bailouts. That's what they are. And they're just done in the name of the tenant. And so if you're just gonna like take the bailout, push the person out, then we end up in the exact same situation, except you're $10,000 richer. You know what I mean? So like really figuring out how to address this moment that we're in an equitable way and recover out of it is going to be kind of, I think, our biggest challenge over the next, 3-6 months, even a year.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, I think your point about sort of the rental assistance is well taken. I actually wanted to ask you a little follow-up about that. And we have this question that came in through the Q&A, and Marisa, we'll get to you, don't worry. I'm not gonna forget you. But I think this kind of flows nicely based on what you were just mentioning, Mike. But the person who has asked the question is mentioning that in their community, rental assistance is being denied by some housing providers. And so just wondering if you've seen that, if you and your members have seen that in Boston at all. Yeah, and just would love to hear your thoughts on kind of like the limitations of like rental assistance programs. And I think that really goes back to what Jose had mentioned, that canceling rent is ideal, right? But if that's not going to happen, then the rental assistance programs are sort of like what we've got. But then, yeah, what has been your experience in your community with those programs.
So I think it's worth saying I support rental arrears programs. I think they're an important thing. I think they're an important social safety net. But let's start with the first barrier, which is, do you have access to internet to apply to the program? The digital divide is like something that is totally like a much, at least for us, it's a much more real thing. Typically we would have, if somebody was facing an arrearage and they wanted to apply for funds, they could come to our office, they could use our computer, that's fine. But then you create this like, everything is kind of shut down and nobody's really coming in person. And you're missing your rent payments. Like, and the only way to apply to this program is online. So like, it doesn't make any, if you're not paying your rent, you're probably not in a place where you have, reliable and fast internet. That's just common sense, I would think. But so that's like hurdle number one. The second hurdle, if you can apply, if you're undocumented, then there's a whole series of legal, of questions that you have. What information do I need to provide? Is this a public charge? Who is this information being shared with? That's an entirely different set of barriers. The third barrier is just the bureaucracy of, so we are like many states are, a lot of the administration of social safety net programs are done not as a part of the government or the state or the county or anything like that. For us, it's done through nonprofits actually. So in Massachusetts, there are six nonprofits that administer, these hundreds of millions of dollars in arrearage programs. And they're set up for normal times to handle a certain volume of applications. But then COVID, this huge economic event happens, they're completely overwhelmed with the amount of requests that they're getting. And it's not like, they can just mobilize more money to hire people. Like, it actually is a longer process. Then you have to get them hired and trained. So like the administrative burden is huge. The fourth piece is, there's nothing that compels the landlord to accept this rent money, especially if there's strings attached. So in Massachusetts, we said, if you're going to take this rent arrears money, that's great. And you have to not displace the person after you take it. But that's apparently too high of a bar for some people. And so many are just opting to not take the money and instead evict no fault. So the kind of last part is, our equitable housing recovery equity act would basically pause all no fault evictions. You have to have a good reason to push somebody out, to evict somebody, health and safety reasons, and non-payment of rent during COVID is not a reason in that case. It's a temporary thing, but what it does in Massachusetts, we're like a lot of states where basically any kind of housing policy has to happen at the state level. We used to have rent control until 1994, and it was put on a statewide ballot. And at the time, 3 cities and towns had rent control: Boston, Brookline, Cambridge. And when it was on the ballot, 351 cities and towns got to vote on whether those 3 towns were able to keep it. So it repealed rent control at that time, but it created this whole new process where basically, if you are a municipal elected official, you have very, very limited powers on what you can do to address housing in your city. Basically, everything housing related has to go through the state. And so for us, the state remains kind of this, I think, more conservative elements of our state house would call it like the state is the adults in the room. The subtext is that they're paternalistic to other cities and towns, but yeah. So removing the ability for people to be evicted no fault, and repealing all of that, basically creating local options for cities like Boston, like Cambridge, like Somerville or Springfield, or other cities in our state, to be able to say, here's what the need is in this city, and in this city, we're going to prevent no fault evictions, now through the state. or permanently. That should be in the hands of the municipality, but it's not right now. And so the equitable housing equity bill that we're working on, it would halt all no-fault evictions, and it would also create the ability of cities to extend how long that moratorium on no-fault evictions goes. And they can extend it indefinitely if they want to. But really, the whole principle should be, if this is what your community needs, it's what you should have the power to do. And I think for us, that's kind of the key demand. It always has been. The demand always is, our communities know what they need, so give us the power to do it.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. That's great. Definitely appreciate that perspective. Okay, Maurice, we were asking about solutions. What solutions do we need at the local, state, and federal levels? Has this crisis changed your perspective, tactics, or understanding of what is possible? Or just say anything else that you want.
I love it.
You're welcome to do so.
I think Jose and Mike are really hitting the nail on the head here. I mean, the solutions are not complicated in this moment. I mean, the rent needs to be canceled. That's different than a moratorium, where if people can't pay 1 month of rent, they're not going to be able to pay 14, 15 months of back rent. So it's a pretty simple solution. We have to cancel rent. We need to install some controls like rent control, so that we don't go right back to the housing instability that was already unacceptable before this crisis. We need to just end evictions over utilities and taxes. It's just a ridiculous thing that is not in the best interest of public health or the public in any way. So we need to end those things. And these are just all, and we need local control. Folks shouldn't be able to just preempt, you shouldn't be able to preempt out what a local community needs to provide good housing to their residents and tenants. I think longer term, we need to be looking towards, a real massive investment in social and public housing. Really, when I take a step back and look at the housing market today, I think the problem is one of overutilization of housing as a commodity, and it's not in any for-profit landlord's best interest to take the money that Mike was talking about, or to make sure that they are checking the place that they're renting for mold, for black mold or other dangerous things. It's just not in their financial interest to do so, right? They're trying to squeeze as much money out of a property as possible. But it is in our public interest, and that is why public housing gets a bad rap, but a new 21st century public housing investment is one that would focus on making sure that we have equitable housing all around the country, and that we are really meeting the standard of what is decent housing for folks. So not, building racially segregated slums, but actually building places that people want to and want to live and can have some dignity. And the final thing I'll say is that I think that from both the federal and probably some state levels, we'll likely see some solution coming down that does involve giving a lot more money to landlords to make up for the many months that they haven't been receiving rent, and to give that money to folks with without any really strong strings attached, is the equivalent of just letting for-profit landlords rob us blind. And we need to make sure that we put in some really strong fair housing requirements, and just a requirement to take the money at all into all of those programs. So, you shouldn't be able to collect your 12 months of back rent and you haven't repaired the leak that's been in your tenant's apartment for 5 years, or there's black mold growing in their basement, or it's infested with roaches and mice. There's a certain standard that I think that we, any reasonable person can agree is good and decent housing, and that should be a requirement for receiving any of the money that is going to be coming down from the federal or state levels. So I don't think that the answers are complicated here. I think that we just need to build the power to do it, and then elected officials at all levels just need to have the guts to do it.
Thanks, Maurice. So to that point then about building power, right, to get things done, I wanted to ask next what people can do within their own communities, right, to get involved. What can people do to be a part of organizing efforts? And what lessons do you have to share with people who either want to get involved or who already are involved in organizing renters specifically in their communities?
I can start here because Mike and Jose at grassroots organizations should really give the bulk of the answer here. But I will say that I started out in organizing actually at the same organization that Jose is based at now, ACE. And one of the really important things that I tell people when they want to get involved is no matter where you are in the country, there is some organization, there's some group of people, there might just be some grandma on a block who's trying to get a bunch of people together to change something that is that's wrong, that they believe is wrong. And if you want to get involved, it won't take a lot of work to find who that is, especially with the internet. You can probably just Google around. But if you if you want to be politically involved, just asking around and going to these community meetings that are likely posted on public message boards that you walk by every day, or anything like that. Just finding your people is really the most important thing to do, and we really need everyone to do that, because it's going to take a lot of folks to really create the type of economy that that we all deserve. So absolutely try and get involved and find your ACE, find your City Life Vida Urbana wherever you can.
Thanks, that's great. Jose, Mike, what do y'all want to share in terms of ways in which people can get involved, or lessons that you've got for folks who are already working and organizing?
Yeah, I think if you yourself are facing, like Maurice said, if you are facing displacement, reach out to find help. Start with your family, go to your neighbors, find your organization. One of the things that we say frequently is leave your shame at the door. This is one of those things where there is no shame around being in a difficult spot. That's not on you. That's on this system, which forces hard spots on a lot of people. So, and the second part is once you reach out, organize your building, organize your block, organize your neighborhood. That's really important. Since the beginning of the pandemic, we've had 13 new buildings or new tenant associations being organized in Boston. I guarantee you, if you're facing bad housing conditions, there's probably somebody else who's faced the same thing or has a similar reason, and would be more than glad to unite with you. And the last thing is, if you are organizing already, this is super cheesy. Mr. Rogers would say, find the helpers, but find the helpers, build relationships with them, media, students, research, legal services, artists. Everybody has a role in a movement for justice, and all help is welcome. And it's our job as organizers to mobilize resources as well as people. So I think that's all I got.
Yeah,
Thanks, Mike. That was great.
Just like Maurice and Mike both said, finding out like what is like a local organization where you live that is already doing this, and definitely like starting by talking to your neighbors, your friends, your family members. And I think it's really important that the people that we're working with, or like the tenants themselves, are the ones that really are like leading this, right? That the solutions are coming from them, that we trust them, right? That we trust in people, I guess. And yeah, and we're just remembering that like we can't do anything by ourselves, right? And like it's gonna take a lot of us, um, and that we're all like in this together, right? Like figuring out how to build this, you know, your your base, right? Finding who your people are and um, getting more people to get involved, because there are people, like Marie said, there's always somebody just waiting for you to knock on their door. And especially now, I think in the beginning of the pandemic, that was one of the big things that we did, like a huge round of calls for several weeks, just called all of our members, supporters, people who had said that they wanted to, that they cared about housing. And we checked in with everybody in the community to see how they were doing. And like people appreciated us checking in on them. We were able to find a lot of people who were actually struggling, didn't know there were protections, didn't know that there was an organization that they can join. And we started by inviting them to come out to Know Your Rights trainings so they can know what rights they have, how, and why it's not enough, and how like the few rights that we do have is because people have organized and fought for them. And the only way we're going to have more is if we continue to fight and organize. And it's crazy how all these things are so connected, because Mike just mentioned that in 1994 they passed a law that took away like the local control in Massachusetts. In 1995, California passed a law that did the same thing, and that's like our like what they call like the holy grail, right? That we're still working on like repealing, um, and it's all systematic, right? Like we've mentioned several times, like housing has been racialized, and like really looking at that history of like where do we live, you know, why do we live there. Um, but I think one of the biggest things, I'll just end with this, is like the relationships, like building those relationships with people. For us at ACE, it's all about leadership development. We start off people with something small. Um, everybody, our thing is that everybody does whatever they can, right? And that's what we need, a lot of people, because you know everybody can do a little bit.
Awesome. Well, I think everybody can do a little bit is a perfect way to end the conversation, right? Because there's something that we can all do, and it's going to look different for each of us, and that's okay. But sort of embracing that and being okay with that, and being willing to do the little bit or a lot of it that we can do is what's most important. And so, with that, I want to thank all of our panelists. Thank you so much. I was really excited to have this conversation, and more than a little nervous to talk to y'all too, because I'm just, we're all so in awe of the work that you are doing, and so excited about the wins that your communities are seeing. And so we really appreciate you being here and sharing your experiences with us. I also want to thank everyone who has attended tonight, those of you who are joining us on Zoom, and as well as those who are joining us on Facebook Live. And we hope that everyone who's watching and who's with us tonight will get involved in the fight against evictions, whether that is in your community that may be outside of Louisiana. If you are in Louisiana, we hope that you will partner with the Louisiana Fair Housing Action Center as we continue to fight to keep people housed during the COVID-19 pandemic. You can engage with us by staying tuned for future action alerts. You can also like us on Facebook, follow us on Instagram and Twitter, and visit lafairhousing.org for more information. If you're someone who maybe is facing eviction or who is having difficulty paying your rent, please do click the COVID-19 resource button on our website, and you can find more information about legal services that are available to you, as well as resources for how you can communicate with your landlord during this time. Also want to remind everyone that Give NOLA Day is next week, and that is a day in which the community here in the local New Orleans area and across the country supports New Orleans-based nonprofits. It's a day of community giving. Any support that anyone gives to the Louisiana Fair Housing Action Center will directly support our fight to keep people housed during the COVID-19 pandemic. We're going to put a link in the chat. You can go ahead and schedule your donation now if you're so inclined at www.givenola.org/Louisiana Fair Housing Action Center. You can also wait until May 4th, which is Give NOLA Day, and make your donation then. So with that, I want to say thanks again and good night.
All right, thank you.